How are we ever going to get 6 of us on this?
One on the end.
We know you've been thinking one would drop out.
Yeah, no.
It's so lively because it's also multiple. You know, sometimes you go to a developing country, it feels very open, and part of it is the economic environment. So
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and for tuning in. For those of you in person, thank you for being the type of people that spend a sunny Wednesday afternoon listening to a policy discussion about clinical trials. You are our people, you are our tribe, we appreciate it. And to those of you tuning in online, thank you as well. I'm delighted to be chairing this conversation and to be partnering with AstraZeneca on it. Onward launched our science programme about 6 or 9 months ago, and one of the real points of emphasis for it was that the experience during the pandemic, but particularly the triumph of the vaccines programme, was a moment when I think folks in the policy world who might not have been excited by science or had not appreciated its potential suddenly did. And that was an access point for us as a think tank to say there is so much more we can do. There is so much we can learn from what went well here and what could have gone better. And on this topic in particular, on how clinical trials, on leveraging the NHS, on leveraging our strengths in life sciences, is one that we've done a significant amount of work on and really looked at. And under Alan, who's leading our science and technology programme, Anna, one of our researchers, will be publishing much more on it. But today, it's less about kind of onwards research and more hearing from some of the leading voices in the field, and in particular hearing from James O'Shaughnessy, Lord O'Shaughnessy, who has led the recent review into clinical trials. So this is one where, as a kind of policy generalist, I'd usually have a really detailed set of stats at the beginning. That is not a good use of your time. Instead, I'm going to very quickly introduce our speakers, move to them, and then leave plenty of time for all of your questions. So to my immediate right, we have Lord James O'Shaughnessy, the leader of the review into UK clinical trials, was himself in government previously at the Department of Health between 2016 and 18, and was one of the kind of founding voices in Onward as a think tank. So he's been very supportive both in terms of this particular topic, but also more broadly the centre-right and the Conservative Party having a voice in this space. To James's right, to my right, we've got Dr. Jennifer Harris, the Director of Research Policy at the Association for the British Pharmaceutical Industry, the ABPI. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for coming along. To my left, Baroness Nicola Blackwood, the Chair of Genomics England, herself also previously a Minister for Innovation at the Department for Health and Social Care under 2 Prime Ministers. And then on the far left, we have Paul Naish, the Head of UK Public Policy at AstraZeneca, and we're delighted that AstraZeneca are supporting this discussion and have partnered with us on this work, and indeed have been a real voice influencing a number of our pieces of work in our science programme. So without further ado, Lord O'Shaughnessy, it'd be really helpful if you could set out kind of why the review came about, what were some of the key things you found, and really what government now needs to do to realise some of the things that you found.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted that Onward is turning its very great capabilities to this subject. So the first thing to say, I'll come back to why the review was published in a minute, but the first thing is just worth reiterating, because it's often, it's easy to get sucked into thinking about how bad everything is, but it's worth stating at the beginning that you don't have to look very far to find magnificent activity from the UK, which is, you know, for all 4 countries of the UK, 4 NHSs of the UK, as well as the wider economy, to find brilliant examples of how well we are doing in clinical trials. So if you look at our early phase clinical trials, phase 1 and 2, the more academic trials, we continue to be extremely highly ranked globally, and indeed the quantity of those has remained fairly consistent over the last few years, if not gone up slightly. You talked about our experience during COVID, which was something of a mixed blessing because lots of activity was turned off at the time, which is part of the reasons we are where we are at the moment. But nevertheless, as the Chancellor likes to say, probably the UK, through its vaccine development and trials, and through the therapeutics done through the recovery and panoramic principle and other trials, has probably saved more lives during the pandemic than any other country. And of course, we have dozens of examples which are in the review of strong innovative practice which is happening today which are great strengths of the UK. So we have the capabilities and we have the potential. But, as you point out, we're having this discussion for a reason, which is we're underperforming. And Jen will talk about, I'm sure, the ABPI data, which itself was sort of the inspiration or the foundation on which the review was established. The fact, by the way, that it is ABPI data, not data that the government knows about itself, is really important, because actually government doesn't really know who's doing what. And that in itself is a problem which I'll return to. But we have, over the last 5 years in the commercial clinical trials, so that's sort of phase 2B, phase 3 trials, and to some extent phase 4, but that's a smaller part of it. We've gone from 50,000 on the NIHR network to around 28,000, so more or less a kind of halving. And we've been falling down the international rankings as a place to do business. And it's important to point out, okay, you might say, well, we've gone from 5% to 2% of our total trials being in phase 3. Why does it matter? There are lots of reasons it matters. It matters first and foremost for patients. If you're doing a late stage trial, you know this drug works. It's just about the size of the effect. And so every patient not on the trial is one patient who is not getting an experimental drug, which it could help them. Of course, they could be on a control arm, but nevertheless, being part of a trial that could help them. So first and foremost, the patient impact. Secondly is the economic impact. This is a very globally competitive environment, and Paul may talk about it in a minute, but if you're thinking about drug companies, they're citing this activity, making hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds worth of investment in R&D capacity around the world, and they are not choosing us. They are choosing Spain and Australia and Poland and other countries. And it's obvious that has an economic problem. The thing that we kind of dug into in the report, which I hope in a way made it the more tangible for the Treasury, of course, who hold the keys to all of this, is that it has a direct financial cost to the NHS. Because if you're spending £9,000, £10,000 recruiting a patient from an NHS hospital, that is, and you're providing the drugs, standard of care and so on, that is money which those trusts will have to cover themselves to treat those patients. And that is worth hundreds of millions of pounds a year in itself, and by a consequence of our decline, we've probably missed out on about £500 million of cold, hard, extra cash that is not from taxpayers. So that is why it has an outsized effect, that's why it matters. What we tried to do in the review is to really kind of explore why this was happening, and we broke that down into 8 problem statements. There was a moment when I was doing the review where I sort of thought it's a bit negative to kind of frame it around problems. Should I do it as sort of, the 8 conditions of success? And actually one of my colleagues who was supporting me in OLS said, look, you're not a minister anymore, you don't need to do that. you can just tell it like it is. So I thought that was very good advice. So we framed it as problems, and I think actually that did bring a sort of sharpness to it. The first and main problem, and let's be sort of frank about this, and I would say this to June if she had been here and she's heard me say it, and it's not a reflection on her or her colleagues, but we are low and slow for approving and recruiting to trials, and a large part of that is to do with capacity in our regulators. So 2 data points which were given to us anonymously but from big global pharma companies, they're in the report. The first is that of the 18 places in Europe where one company did its trials, the UK was the second slowest to approve its trials. And the second data point by an equally large global pharma company was that compared to our peer group, so think of countries with similar population sizes, Italy, France, Germany, the UK gets half the allocation, or in fact less than that, compared to Germany, of clinical trial numbers, because we are so slow and therefore we don't recruit people, and therefore you can see it's a sort of cycle downwards. That is the main problem, and a lot of what the report talks about is to do with addressing that problem. There's also lack of transparency and good data, which I mentioned. No one really knows who's doing well or who's not doing well, and so there's a sort of lack of accountability that flows from that, and that lack of accountability for underperformance I found to be quite a problem. So the system is not performance managed well. People basically get paid to have infrastructure to do work, and whether or not they do it or do it well doesn't really influence whether they get paid again. And then there is a lack of systematic prioritisation within the NHS. Now the recent bill provides potentially an opportunity, or act, an opportunity for that, because research is a responsibility of the new integrated care systems, but we need to act on that. At the moment it's theoretical. Other problem statements included a lack of incentives, so just the bald incentives, professional, financial and other, for clinicians, doctors, nurses and others to get involved, low profile. that research has in kind of clinical conversations between doctors, nurses, patients, and so on. A big one which we might unpack in discussion, which is not taking advantage of our amazing data assets. We talk a great game on this, frankly we don't yet deliver. And then if you think about the way that trials are changing, which is towards more population scale trials, primary care becomes really important. It's a great potential strength of ours, but again, not one we're fully leveraging. So those were the sort of problem statements, and there are 27 recommendations which I am not going to go through. You'll be delighted to know. But there were 5 which I did say were most important to get sort of funded and committed to early. The first relates to that main problem I talked about, which is the kind of slow and low approvals process. We've just got to scale up and bring back the expertise that we've lost, particularly from the MHRA, but other regulators, so that we are delivering world-leading turnaround times, which are currently, in Europe at least, you would go to Spain for that. We need to be at least as good as Spain. This is a kind of boring but important topic, which is the way that trials are contracted and costed, and all the rest of it is, how can I put this politely, it's painstaking and very repetitive, and it is extremely off-putting, and is part of the reason we're slow. So this is the idea that we should have a national comprehensive and mandatory approach to contracting, and actually that should be enforced with carrots and sticks, which the carrot being an indemnity cover, the stick being if you don't use the system, you don't get public funding. The third is talking about real-time data. I've talked about the importance of that for patients, so that you know what trials are. There are clinicians, actually for businesses, industry themselves, to know where to put trials, who were the most successful people, and of course for us as taxpayers to know that it is actually improving. Then there's something really important about contacting patients about research. As I said, we might get into this more in the discussion, but at the moment you can't really proactively contact a patient unless they've already consented to be contacted. So it's a catch-22. Whereas if you think about it, being approached for a trial that might help you, in my view, that should be part of direct care. And if it's part of direct care, you've got different legislation that governs data protection, and you're in a very different ballgame. And the final one was these clinical trial accelerator networks, which is a way of trying to disrupt the system to create new platforms around disease areas or therapeutic modalities that are not just about publicly funding sort of existing regional infrastructure and a bit of that kind of Buggins turn approach we tend to take in the NHS, but actually to back the most entrepreneurial people. So that £120 million, £1 million, not bad. I can't fault the government so far in what they've done to sort of support and embrace the recommendations. But if I'm being honest about it, the big risk now is implementation risk.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I've no reason to think it won't happen, because, as I say, the support has been excellent. But I've also been a minister. I know what can happen. And so the biggest thing that we all have to keep an eye on, whatever our interest in this field, is that this and all the other things that need to happen actually happen. As I say, I'm optimistic about it, because I really do believe everyone understands the size of the opportunity, but that is obviously the big risk that we won't take advantage of this amazing opportunity that we have.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dr. Shaughnessy. And I should have said at the beginning, we were meant to be joined by Dame June Rain from the MHRA, who had to give her apologies. And I've realised as you were speaking that what we don't have is someone sort of accountable for doing this stuff, or from government, which we usually do, so everyone can kind of swing, and then we'll, exactly. Let's pile on, and we'll then give someone a right to reply afterwards, or something like that. Dr. Jennifer Harris, let's come to you.
Brilliant. Well, James has said a lot of bullet points that were on my list of
Sorry.
opening remarks. So, I mean, James mentioned industry clinical trials obviously bring huge benefits to patients, to the NHS, to the economy. We saw a loss in a single financial year of about £500 million from the lack of clinical trials that were done during the pandemic. So we know that there is a huge interest and reason why doing industry clinical trials in the UK and being the go-to place to do that is important. Thinking about the kind of growth and investment agenda that both the Prime Minister and Secretaries of State have laid out in terms of ambition, clinical trials account for about 50% of investment in R&D by pharmaceutical companies, which means if we are really to kind of use life sciences and clinical research as a lever for growth and investment, we absolutely have to get the clinical trials bit right. We need to fix that. So looking at the kind of challenges and decline that we've seen over the years, it's obviously frustrating to see that happening, given the opportunities and benefits that we know that those trials bring. There's a lot of narrative around the fact that the pandemic has kind of caused this dramatic decline that we've seen in industry clinical trial activity. What I want to say is that we've been seeing decline in accordance to our data even before the pandemic. The challenges that we are talking about today, absolutely love the fact that we have got a magnifying glass on some of those challenges, but they are not necessarily new. We have been having this conversation for a number of years. We know what the problems are, and we have known for several years what the problems are. James has very well articulated what those problem statements are, and we completely agree with all of those. To kind of bucket them up, I suppose, in our minds, these problems fit into kind of three buckets. One is around getting the basics right. This is the wiring in the ecosystem that we need to have sorted out in order to have kind of seamless end-to-end setup and delivery of clinical trials. So that speaks to some of the cost and contracting points that James mentioned, the regulatory approvals piece, but also the mechanisms that we have to find and recruit patients to clinical trials. That's one bucket. The second, and this is the huge elephant in the room, and that is capacity. Clinical trials are conducted in the NHS. Research is not separate to care, particularly when you're in those late stage clinical trials. The reason why you're doing them is because you're going to go to market, you're going to license. These are medicines that are the future treatments on the NHS in a couple of years' time, less than that. So we have to try and really tackle this point around how do you really deliver research as part of care. It is an option for some patients, and for some patients where there's no treatment out there at all, the clinical trial is perhaps their only option. Yeah. So we have to really tackle that front on. The NHS is losing staff left, right and centre, and yet we know that research active healthcare professionals enjoy their jobs more. You've got higher staff retention in research active sites. It's really important that healthcare professionals, be that a data entry person all the way up to a clinician, has time to do this research, and actually they see it as part of their job, a critical part of delivering good care that's going to improve patient outcomes. We have to get that capacity piece right. The third bit speaks to capability, and James talked at the start around the fact that we've got some excellent and brilliant examples of research that's happening in the UK. We do have a fantastic science base, and we do have the capability to take something from that basic science that's happening in our universities all the way through to a marketed product to patients. We have that capability, but we are not capable of taking something all the way through and being really competitive end to end. We sometimes also get wrapped up about thinking about some of the innovative new ways of doing research and doing clinical trials, such as decentralisation and all of the new kind of medicines that are coming through that have companion diagnostics and whatnot. But there is also bread and butter research that needs to happen. So we need to also not get carried away in thinking that capability in the UK means just doing the super high-end, cutting-edge innovative stuff. It needs to be that diversity of portfolio that includes some of the bread and butter of what our industry does. So across those three buckets, yes, we have lots of challenges. We saw those challenges before the pandemic. The pandemic has exacerbated that, particularly from a capacity perspective. I think all of this is really well recognised, obviously, in the O'Shaughnessy review, but also recognised in the UK-wide vision for clinical research. This is the first time in years that we've had all devolved nations in England come together and say, we all know what needs to happen. James has come in and put some excellent actions on the table which can help us really deliver on that vision. So now we need to just crack on and deliver. It comes back to implementation time and time again. If we want growth and if we want more clinical trials, we have to address the challenges in those three buckets. Yes, there are some priority actions that need to happen first, and some longer term challenges that will take a bit longer time to fix. But we've got an opportunity now, with the momentum that the review has created, the fact that we've got an aligned vision across the UK nations, and we have the new clinical research network coming in January next year, I believe, early next year, the new research delivery network under the NIHR. And we've got the Health and Care Act legislative mandate to promote, facilitate and report on clinical research in the NHS, strengthened from what was in our previous legislation. And we've got broader negotiations underway with government under the voluntary scheme about how we can leverage industry's contribution to really go further and faster on areas that we want to deliver on within life sciences. These are kind of coming together now at a time point where we need to really implement now in order to restore that company confidence in the UK as a destination. Otherwise we'll continue to see that direction of investment to other countries, and it will be patients at the end of the day that lose out.
Yep.
I think that's fairly succinct.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. Thank you. Very much appreciated. Baroness Blackwood, over to you.
Thank you. Well, it's always difficult to speak after two such informed presenters, because a lot of the things have been said. Yeah, well, I'm glad you're lost. But, obviously I agree with what has already been said. And I'm going to just try and provide a bit of a wider lens, I think, to the discussion. The first thing is, the UK does have some very strong core strengths in UK life sciences. We're strong in genomics, AI, in data, and we shouldn't believe, because of the challenges that we're having at the moment, that those do not exist. The second thing is that the UK government and life sciences environment has made some really good strategic choices over the long term, which are also bearing fruit. So we can talk about Biobank, we can talk about Our Future Health, we can talk about Genomics England. And, we are getting outputs from that, even in the context of a wider difficult picture. So at Genomics England, we've had readouts from the 100,000, where 25% of the rare disease patients got a diagnosis for the first time, 50% of the cancer patients were found to have an actionable mutation. We have over 600 active research projects in our research environment, 1,800 researchers, industry partners. 8 out of 10 of the major pharmas are doing big projects with us. This is a good news story, and we are at the forefront of genomics globally in the UK, and we should be really proud of that. So, I just want to say that there is some good news going on here. But what is also true is that all of us bear the scars of, underlying health data. We know that it needs to flow better. We know it needs to be linked better. We know it needs to be more accessible. And so the work that Tim Ferriss and Claire Bloomfield have been working on to really make that work in practice is fundamental to making sure that the recommendations that James has made will work in practice. And so those will be secure data environments. There will be one national one, which will bring together the very curated data environments, and there will be several regional ones of 3 to 9 million, which will be linked in effective and safe manners with interoperability. And so those fundamental pieces of work which are ongoing at the moment are a really important part of the picture to understanding how we are going to upskill and become globally competitive. And overlaying that, we have to make sure that the entire pipeline to commercialisation works and operates, because I completely agree with the arguments that have been made. We have to have patient contact. I personally would like to have approvals for contact and research in the NHS app. Yep. Single contracting is critical. I spoke to one industry player in the States who said that in order to do a pilot in the NHS, they had to do 100 individual separate contracts. This is not realistic in this day and age, and it's not necessary either in the day of digital contracting. If we bring in recognition for medtech as well as for pharma, there are going to be capacity issues in the pipeline from MHRA to NICE, and so that needs to be not only resourced but also new processes will need to come into place. And of course, we do also need to look at the resourcing of the NHS for research. We did a piece of work on the House of Lords Science and Technology Select Committee looking at clinical academics and research time, and it's clear that there is a very leaky pipeline for clinical academics because of security of those roles, because of the pay in those roles which are lower than the wider NHS roles. And finally, of course, we should really be protecting research time within the NHS environment, which is very challenging at the moment, but given the findings, which are that this actually returns funding into the NHS, it is a false economy not to do so. And so the last thing I would say is, I think that a follow-on report that we should be asking James to do is looking at adoption into the NHS, because it'll be great if we manage to improve our performance on clinical research. And I think that if we do if we do implement these recommendations, we will manage to be, not just globally competitive, but probably one of the most competitive countries in the world based on the foundations that we have. But if we are not adopting those products effectively and fast into the NHS, then patients will not be benefiting, and that is why we are all here.
Paul.
Agree with all of that. That's really easy. And I'm going to really try hard not to dial back to gloom, because I think you're all absolutely right. I mean, there are great things going on, and there's great things planned for the future. We have to recognise the little bit of gloom in what I've just said, though, that the UK is really good at planning for a great future, and it always seems to be tomorrow. I'm from AstraZeneca. I used to have to sort of say who we were. Most people have heard of us after the last few years, but we are the largest company on the FTSE in the UK. We spend about £2.5 billion on R&D in the UK each year, about a quarter of our global R&D spend. We're responsible for about 1.5% by value of all UK exports. And at any one time, we've got about 250 clinical trials ongoing in a year in the UK. So the UK is a big part of our home, and we're sort of existentially bound to the UK succeeding. Although perhaps less and less as other countries get more and more competitive. I think, I do agree with everything that's been said. There are some brilliant examples of things in the UK. We can talk about great trials that have been done. The Gallery trial read out recently in terms of cancer screening,
really
absolutely, I mean, really exciting and potentially revolutionary. But we also need to make sure that we don't get so proud of the shiny things that we forget the underlying numbers and the trends. And there's really nothing we disagree with in your review. I think it's great, it's fantastic, but the implementation gap is the absolute challenge. It's the what next and how fast. Yeah. And certainly what we've thought is that, we need to recognise our starting point for all the good things, and here's the gloom bit, and I'll try and climb back out of it, is that we're starting from a really difficult place. Jen's already talked about how clinical trials performance was struggling before COVID. COVID showed us what can be done, and it can be amazing. It was amazing in many ways. Some of that was because we sort of stopped doing everything else.
Definitely.
But there are also other learnings that we can take, and we mustn't let them slip away. And I fear we might, but your review suggests that we may be able to capture some of them. But as Jen said, we need to crack on, which I think should be the title of your successor report. And the challenge with that, Nicola, you talked about adoption. I mean, I have to be the first person to drop the clangor of the voluntary scheme beyond what you said, Jen, and say that that is a real elephant in the room in all of these questions about the global life sciences industry investing in the UK. I mean, we've had a decade now of a formal government policy in the UK that spending on innovative medicines must decline as a share of NHS budget. Lots of rhetoric about containing runaway growth, but the policy of the government has been to ensure and drive decline in spending as a share. And that's what's led to the situation of companies paying 26.5% of their revenue, not profit but revenue, back to the Department of Health this year. And that gets attention. That really gets attention in global boardrooms when other countries are at sort of 7 to 10%. So I think we have to recognise that difficult starting point. I'm not going to say any more about the negotiations that will be ongoing this year, but it's a really critical moment for sending signals. In the adoption point beyond that sort of headline issue of the commercial environment, I think you're absolutely right, and it really matters for clinical trials, because not only does it matter for the patients who may not be getting the treatment, but quite frankly, we can't do a study in the UK if the standard of care isn't there that we want to investigate against. We can't do a study in patients who've progressed on drug X if drug X isn't used in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And it may not be available at all, but also we have the challenge about how available it is. And you look at a nice, great, respected institution, has a very good record of saying yes to drugs brought to them for licensing, for reimbursement. But we don't look so closely at the ones that aren't brought to them for reimbursement because we know they're never going to say yes. And when they do say yes, about 40% of those yeses are for less than the licensed population from the MHRA. And on average, in those 40%, it's about a third of the population. So there's a lot of people in this country not getting the treatments that other people are getting. And that really matters for those patients, for their families, but it also matters for whether you can come and do the research. We also can't do the trials here if we think, we can't do them ethically if we think there's no chance of launching the drug here commercially. We really can't build up all that expectation and have patients on a treatment if we can see no path to launching. And that's why the commercial reality really matters for this discussion as well. And that's a competition with other countries, as is the clinical trial space. And in the clinical trials competition, your review's fantastic, but other countries are way ahead of us. Other regions are ahead of us. I think we're losing the race against Catalonia at the moment.
100%.
Not just Spain. You know, everything there that you talk about in your review is there, has been there for ages, and Spain are going around the world saying, look what we've got. Any takers? Like anything else, can we make it easier for you? We've got a great plan for 5 years' time.
In France.
And I think that the critical thing that we have to get to, it seems to me, is delivering on your ambition. The doubling and doubling again is really exciting. That's where the gloom can end, because it feels really achievable. I love that Professor Martin Landry came out after your review. I don't know if you saw his quote.
It should be 10xing.
Should be 10 times. Let's get to 20% of the global, which should be a fantastic, I mean,
of course.
Why not? Let's crack on, as Jen says. It seems to us that your ambition is right, at least for now. We've got to walk before we can run. And it is a bit like that, really, for beyond the shiny examples. But that doubling and doubling means that you're predicting to the Chancellor and the Treasury and to the Secretaries of State a revenue stream for the NHS in 4 years' time of £1 billion per year every year. £1 billion every year is what we in the industry call a blockbuster. When we think we've got a blockbuster on our hands, with massive respect, and it is a start and there may be more, we invest a little bit more than £121 million. And that's probably the challenge, is what do we do next? Do we have the appetite in the UK to really bet on the amazing foundations we've got? Because the foundations are so strong. The foundations of early science mean that we don't regret for a second having £1 billion building in Cambridge doing fantastic science next to Adam Brooks, next to the MRC. It's fantastic. But when it comes to investing in clinical trials, when it comes to really making that direct in-country impact on patients with clinicians in the UK, that's where there's a dangerous question mark at the moment. So look, we think there's a lot to like in what you've put in the review, but if we could have written one extra thing in it, and what we hope we might look at next is an urgent capacity uplift. So we ran an event about a year ago with some Department for Health colleagues and some researchers. And the researchers kept saying, what we need is more capacity. I need to be able to hire a nurse, a data entry person or whatever. And the DH colleagues said, you can have whatever you like, but you can't have that. And they said, but that's what we need. And they said, well, you can have whatever you like, but you can't have that. We think there are great examples of solving those capacity issues. I mean, this government put in place the additional roles reimbursement scheme for primary care. So we need pharmacists in primary care. We need them in clinics. Let's put £1 billion a year aside and say, when you need it, when you make the good business case, do it. You can have it for a year and then fund it yourself. That's a pretty good model. The model we have for clinical trials, and I had this conversation with a trialist just the other day, is show us you've got the work and then we'll consider giving you the staff to get the work done. And based on that, they can't give us a convincing argument that if we bring our trials here, they'll get recruited. So we need to pump prime. We need to inject an urgent capacity solution. I believe it will actually create new capacity. There's always a risk with capacity solutions of cannibalizing capacity, and it's not as if we're swimming in doctors and nurses in the UK. But I really think that if you ask one of the 1 in 4 consultants over the age of 60 who's gone part-time as they move towards the end of their career, would you like to come back and spend an extra 2 days in the hospital doing the same job that you do the rest of the time? They'll say no thanks. If they say, would you like to come back and drive a massive uplift in our cutting edge research, they might have a different answer. So that's where we think we can go next, an urgent capacity uplift that really bets on our entrepreneurs in the NHS who can get this research done, and deliver for patients, but also for the economy, and get our industry excited about the UK again.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Ending on an optimistic note there. Noted.
There's
Very
optimism
good.
somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Shaughnessy, I want to come back to you on some of that. If I could just very cheekily throw in my own question on the implementation gap, right? So, we're a think tank. Sometimes we say there's a risk around implementation, and usually by saying that, there's kind of something that we can't really say we're alluding to, right? And that might be we're worried the Treasury are going to block this, or we are worried that there's not enough ministerial leadership, or it will slip down the order of political priorities, or there isn't the money there to do this more broadly. When you kind of talk about the risk being implementation, is there a particular challenge that you think, look, if something kills this when we look back in 10 years, or means that we don't realise the potential you alluded to, what is that particular thing? What's it going to be?
I will answer your question, but I just want to come back to one other point, which is something that actually Jen and Nicola and Paul have alluded to, either explicitly or implicitly, which is the sort of capacity issue. Because what anyone who's read this will have noticed is that what I don't say is that a certain amount of time of doctors, nurses should be protected in order to do more research. And the reason I said that is because that already exists and nobody pays any attention to it.
Yeah.
And so I just think if you look at where we are as a country, you look at waiting lists, not just elective surgery, cancer waiting times, primary care, A&E, ambulance, you name it, right? The reality of life on the front line is that people are dealing with that. But that's also true of most other countries post-COVID. So we're not unusual in that. And other countries have nevertheless managed to move ahead in this field, as we've been hearing, despite suffering similar problems. And so what I was trying to do was be a bit more kind of immediate term and maybe a bit more practical than sort of talking about that protecting time, which of course would be a lovely thing to do, but I just think it's sort of slightly unrealistic. The other reason I thought it wasn't quite necessary is that I detected a lot of latent entrepreneurialism in the NHS, which actually, like 100 contracts, we just snuff out of people. That if you cleared out the undergrowth, which was a phrase that somebody used who was a principal investigator in an NHS organisation, around the sort of bureaucracy, whether that is like endless amendment discussions with the MHRA, or it's the contracting and costing, or all these things, actually there is a huge desire to do more research, just what you were talking about. There's a data point we have in here from the Royal College of Physicians which says that 57% of doctors want to do more research. So I have no doubt that actually if we are effective in clearing out the undergrowth in the ways that I've described, and indeed other ways too, then actually there will be a kind of natural rebound. Now there are a lot of other issues that need to be dealt with, of course, but I'm actually pretty optimistic on that front. On implementation risk, so how would you define that? Well, it's twofold. Firstly, this is like a multi-partner thing, right? So it's not just a case of saying to somebody, sort it all out, and you hold them accountable. There are a lot of moving parts, funders, regulators, people, bodies that are actually active in doing the research, industry and so on. So that obviously just makes it more complex. It was the reason that I said it should be overseen by the Life Sciences Council, because actually it includes all of those and it keeps it at a high enough level, which alludes to the second point, which is we all think this is a very important topic. It is a very important topic. There are lots of really big important topics. 7 million people on the waiting list, war in Ukraine, climate change, etc. And it's just a bandwidth problem, right? So that's just an inevitable thing, however much you care about this and however important you think it is. The other bit is actually for the organisation that funds most of the research in England. I have to be specific here because it is different in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. The NIHR, this involves doing things a different way, and indeed with these clinical trial accelerator networks, doing things in a radically different way that ought to become the norm over time. And indeed, one of the recommendations in here is that the clinical research network, or RDN bit, RDN is it going to be called? Yeah. A bit of it actually ought to be spun out into Genomics England-like organisation that could be held properly accountable, have a separate board, leadership, and be funded to carry out certain tasks and be held accountable. So that is inevitably a challenge to an existing organisation. Now, Again, with the NIHR, I've no reason to think that they won't embrace it. Indeed, quite a lot of them, that £121 million is their money. But it is asking an existing organisation to radically change the way it does business. And as we know, status quo, inertia, etc., tends to be a powerful force in policy.
Very good. Jennifer, if I could come to you with a question. So you talked about, in terms of implementation risks, we are coming into an election, right? And you've got two kind of Conservative peers on the panel. I'm curious kind of how the conversations with Labour are going on this front. They have talked a lot about industrial strategy. They've got a kind of much more kind of pro-market or pro-private sector message coming out of the party more recently. Do you sense that discontinuity in political leadership or in the government might affect this agenda, or actually is it an area where cross-party consensus is emerging?
So I definitely think it's more the latter. We saw Labour's health mission come out a couple of weeks ago now, which speaks very explicitly to the need to recover clinical trials in the UK and the benefit it brings. Very aligned in terms of some of those custom contracting pieces and getting the wiring right. So I do think that's been acknowledged, which is good to see. We obviously are doing a lot of work, across benches on this one and engaging Labour ahead of that. The other piece that I envisage still being a very hot topic on the table is that the NHS recovery isn't going to happen overnight, which means that I imagine this is still going to be a really important area of priority for any incoming government post-election. And to speak to James's point around prioritisation, we still have to make some choices. We can't keep saying to global industry, I'm sorry, the NHS is a bit overrun at the moment. that companies are already planning clinical trials for next year, for the years to come, and we have to make some choices about whether or not we do want to really support growth via clinical trials and other R&D initiatives to support the NHS at the end of the day. But I think this is going to be an area that will still be on the table, and we're going to still be having those conversations.
Very good.
After the election.
Good. There are about 20 minutes left, and so I want to open up to questions and ensure we have plenty of time. So would anyone like to jump in with the first question? And when you are ready to do so, please wait for a mic to come to you. Who's going to be that? Yeah, because one person and loads of hands will shoot up. Okay, question right back there, and then we'll go to the question here at the front. And I'll take a couple at a time and then pass them through.
Thanks very much. James Hargrave from Daiichi Sankyo, a Japanese pharmaceutical company. I just wondered if we could dig a bit more into how we kind of break this vicious narrative cycle that we've got of clinical trials good, lead to inward investment, shiny new medicines. Then on the health service side, shiny new medicines, they're expensive, that's a cost, that means less nurses, less beds and so on. And it doesn't feel like we can really make much progress as long as that's the tension in the system, so I don't know if you have more to say on that.
Thank you, James. This question just the front here. Any more? Three more?
Thank you. Isabel from Animal Free Research UK. So we're certainly seeing mounting evidence that the sort of human-specific research techniques like organ on a chip and artificial intelligence and so on can sort of help to accelerate the process of getting medicines ultimately to market more safely and quickly by providing results that are more directly relevant to patients. So I wondered about your thoughts about what steps the government can be taking to sort of support the development of these technologies further and sort of maximise the benefits that we can get from them.
Thank you, Isabel. And we'll take one more question just from up here. So we'll take in three.
Hi there, thanks. Hilary Leashing from AstraZeneca. I have a really quick question. It was just in terms of implementation, how you see the report laddering up next to the Balance or McLean review, and then also the review that's just come out by Rod and Sinker, or is going to come out by Rod and Sinker, and how that can kind of really drive implementation, having them all in parallel. Thanks.
Very good. AstraZeneca teaming up with the questions. Love it.
Scary with that. Do you think they're going to be corrected from
Baroness Blackwood, let me come to you on this first question from James about this kind of trials good, new medicines bad. So you're kind of nodding as Paul was talking about the challenges with the current voluntary scheme. How do we get beyond that dynamic?
Well, I mean, I think the reality is that on the ground it's going to be tight. The funding is tight. The situation is tight, and so it's always going to feel a as though there are difficult choices to be made. But when you are in the clinic and you're getting an option of a life-saving drug, I mean, you think about Zolgensma, which came through at a price of 1.7 million, it made headlines. If that's given before the age of 2, that is curative. And that is not only game-changing for those patients who have a horrendous degenerative disease, MND, but it saves an enormous amount of money for the NHS. And I think that is starting to be understood across the system, but it doesn't make any of these choices easy. And so I just think there's always going to be a push and pull when you're spending these enormous amounts of money. And the reason I think we are in a much more sort of testy part of the debate at the moment is because a lot of novel technologies are starting to come through the system, and they have an upfront cost, very high upfront capital costs, but also we're going to have to start designing new regulatory and policy pipelines, and there's also needs to be some new capacity design. I mean, if you have AI designed clinical trials, you have to bring in new expertise into MHRA and NICE and so on, and so we're just at a moment of change in the system because of new, a lot of novel technologies that are coming through, and so that involves a lot of choices, and everybody has a slightly different preferred choice. And that's not a bad thing. What you're seeing is the public debate about how we get the best outcome, and that's a democracy. But I think we have a track record of making some pretty good strategic choices in this country, and I'm fairly confident we'll come out at the right end of it.
Paul, let me come to you on Hillary's question, which is a bit kind of AZ to AZ, but I'm genuinely curious. There are...
Just see if she'll text me the answer.
So a range of reviews that have just been released, one just about to come out.
Yeah.
How do these things come together? And actually, in kind of a more pointed way, to James's point on bandwidth, is there a risk that there are a kind of range of different very important reviews coming through, and who's responsible for putting them together, prioritising the actions?
Can I be naughty and add one comment first on the cost?
Of course,
piece?
yeah.
I think we've seen huge transformations before, and the sky hasn't fallen in, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't grapple with it. Absolutely, I agree with everything you said. But when we saw sort of cancer start to be unpicked a bit, we had the same conversations then about this is going to be a catastrophe. You're going to find a cure for cancer and it's going to cost a fortune. And you said, well, hang on a minute, dial back a bit, cure for... So I think it is something we need to grapple with. I think that the starting point, though, should be that we don't have and haven't had an innovative medicine spending problem in this country for a long time. When you look at medicine spend growth before rebates, it's grown slower than NHS spending.
Yeah.
So I think part of it is just thinking about the starting point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Before we sort of cry fire in a theatre, because I think it scares the living daylights out of the patients who want the treatments that are coming. Mm-hmm. On your specific point, and I've given Hilary more time to text me the answer and she still hasn't. I think bandwidth is the massive challenge, and if I may be so bold, having someone who's worked in global policy for years and years, the UK has a unique ability to produce many strategies. The nice thing at the moment is that when you think about those three different things, they feel like three different things and there's a lot going on, but they're all going in exactly the same place. They're all about can we actually tighten up our regulatory process so that it has the right risk-benefit balance. They're all about can we make sure that the NHS truly is a partner for innovation and embraces that innovation in a way that doesn't only help patients but helps the NHS as well. Mm-hmm. In exactly examples like, a lifetime of being cured versus a lifetime of suffering and NHS engagement. Mm-hmm. So I think all of those reviews are actually going exactly the same direction. I think as long as we step back and think about things that way, as long as we think about a patient being treated for their prostate cancer in a trial is still a patient being treated for their prostate cancer, they're not two competing priorities, then I think we'll be all right. So I don't worry so much about the bandwidth issue. I worry about the perception of bandwidth issue more. Mm-hmm. So I think we just need to be really clear with people, particularly on the front line, who, when we set up our clinical trials, we ask US principal investigators to comment on the protocols, and they come back with pages of comments done between working hours. We ask UK principal investigators to comment, and we get some hurried notes at 3 a.m. Because they're trying to do it as a side hustle. I say that with massive respect for all UK principal investigators. You're amazing. But we need to be mindful of that and not scare people with the number of things coming, and just be really clear in the strategic intent and the strategic direction. Because I don't think we're trying to do too many things.
Sure.
I think we're doing the right number of things. We just need to do them well and do them fast.
Adam, can I come in on the
course you can,
review,
Jen, yeah,
the review question? ABPI has been involved in kind of all three of these kind of key reviews: O'Shaughnessy, Patrick Vallance, or the Patrick Vallance Pro Innovation Regulation Review, and the Roland Syncopes. And what has been really encouraging is the crosstalk between those leading those three reviews. I mean, James will probably speak to this more directly than I will, but my perception is that there is join up. Roland is saying, how do we amplify and support O'Shaughnessy implementation? John Bell, leading on the life sciences component of the Pro Innovation Regulation Review, is saying, how do we ensure we get clinical trial regulation in here that's in line with what's happening in what's being said on O'Shaughnessy? So I do think there is join up. However, to Paul's point, it has a real risk of being seen as completely separate work streams unless you are deeply involved in some of the conversations that are happening as part of those pieces. And from a global industry perspective, what you want to get away from is the perception that we just keep generating policy. As I say, crack on.
Very good
right?
at that.
Yeah, we are. James, let me come to you particularly on all the questions, but Isabel's one about kind of human-specific treatments, the potential for
Yeah, I think, so I'm obviously well out of my comfort zone at this point, but the development of that kind of technology and actually the onset of quantum computing promises an extraordinary new age of drug discovery, which we are potentially about to embark on, where it will become almost basic to actually discover, just as we have started to do, I think, with this new antibiotic, for example, that's discovered the other day. But being able to compute entire human biology on a single computer, which is just beyond digital computers. So I think we are at a very exciting threshold, bit out of scope of my review, obviously, but actually we are here in experimental territory. So this is kind of Research Council funding, and I think one of the interesting questions which I'm going to follow up on is just trying to understand actually what the MRC, the EPSRC and others are doing in this area, because clearly that combination ought to play to our strengths as a country. We need to take advantage of it. If I may, just quickly to James's question.
Yeah.
Look, we'd like to be able to have all medicines and pay top dollar for all of them. In reality, what we're going to have to do, to Nicola's point, is be very strategic and say that we just are going to spend more time and attention and money on some areas and not others. And if you think about it, we've done that a bit because we've got a major condition strategy coming for the NHS, and we've got life sciences missions, and guess what? They more or less overlap. What was interesting about doing this review is the bit in the middle, the clinical trials bit, we're basically agnostic. We don't really prioritise one thing over another. Now, of course, Nicola's, it's about making choices, and at the moment we are resisting making choices. We don't have that luxury anymore. We are going to have to prioritise, whether it's rare diseases, whether it's cancer, whether it's dementia. In a way, it doesn't matter, but we have to make choices and be strong in those, from bench to bedside and all the way through. And we're clearly capable of doing that. But as I say, making those choices in the area of trials is going to be part of the solution to that. And if I may, just on the reviews, the thing that I think is potentially going to be a big change here, which June I'm sure would have talked about, is the MHRA will be effectively moving to a rubber stamping regime for other stringent regulators. And the fact that if something's approved by the FDA or the EMA, it more or less sails through here is going to be a very, very big change. And to give you an example of the kind of change it might mean, if the FDA approves, getting into a slightly different subject here, but they're talking about the sort of politics of it, psychedelic medicines, so psilocybin and so on for the treatment of PTSD or whatever it is going to be basically new for that to be presented here. And that's going to be very interesting because we are to some extent going to lose control over the kind of medicines that get approved here that can be marketed here but are not yet reimbursed. And that's going to open up a whole other... Now, I think, generally speaking, we shouldn't be imposing our own regulatory processes, but it's going to create political and financial pressures that I don't think are quite anticipated.
Baroness Blackwood, you wanted to come in quickly on Isabel's question, and then I'll come to you, Jen.
also
Yeah.
Isabel's
Well, I was
question.
just going to say, I mean, obviously we have great strengths in both AI and bio, and there's a really exciting growth in that sector, and a number of companies growing up, and a lot of VC funding going into the sector. My other hat is I chair Oxford University Innovation, and we track a lot of the companies that are coming out in that sector. Obviously, we're already proud of Accenture, Isomorphic Labs, but also there's some that are kind of slightly more under the radar, like Actorus, LabGenius, probably Genetic, and these are companies which I think are going to really start changing the nature of not only the pace of trials, but also some of the cost profile. And so obviously there are a number of angles that you can look at the benefits of these companies, but one of the challenges I think they face is a lot of these companies either come from the bio angle, and so they have a lot of specialists who understand the biology challenges, or they are AI specialists. And when we've been talking to people, what we really need to start thinking about is the skills training in the UK about training bilingual AI bio. And I think the UK is really well placed for that. And so if we're thinking about how we do support this agenda, I think that's what we need to start thinking about.
We've got 5 minutes left, and I want to get a few more questions in. So, and this is of course the point, a flurry of hands gone up. So let's take those 3, and I'll ask people to be disciplined and maybe direct some of them. So there's one at the front here, one back there, and one over here. Was that hand?
Yeah, it was.
Thank you.
Yep.
You. I'm Nish
We get a mic. We can hear you. It's for the people online, of which there are thousands, I'm sure.
I'm Nish from the Association of British Health Tech Industries, ABHI. My question is a bit of a segue from the comments before, and I understand all the points around bandwidth and contracting. My point is about, in the future, research might be about health data and using new tools and techniques. And I'm interested in the panel's views about enthusing the public to say we're happy for our data to be used down the line. Maybe not right now, but in the future, the research into health tech.
And your name again, sorry?
Nishan from ABHI.
Nishan. Yeah. Yep, the second one was just there.
Hi, I'm Jack Logan. I work for Anne-Marie Morris, the Member of Parliament for Newton Abbot, and she's also the Chair of the Access to Medicines and Medical Devices. Mine's more legislative-wise. Obviously, the government have just responded to the review that was produced, the consultation, that was produced. They're using the Medicines and Medical Devices Act kind of as the basis of it, and then changing around the statutory instruments and those sorts of things. My question was primarily based on how important do you think that the next few parliamentary terms are in terms of embedding this legislation in to improve the implementation scheme, and also what would you like to see in that, and what can parliamentarians do?
Very good. Is it Jack?
Yeah.
Great. And then one question just up here.
Thanks everyone. Helena Fox from Boston Consulting Group. I would be interested to know your thoughts. I'd like to unpick a bit more on the use of healthcare data specifically to overcome the challenges in recruiting for clinical trials. I know you touched on the reaching out proactively to patients through the NHS app, but I'd like to unpick that more.
Yeah.
Excellent. Baroness Blackwood.
Okay. So there's a couple of things. In terms of public confidence in use of data, there's a lot of best practice around engaging with the public in principle around the use of data, and actually I think public sentiment around this has moved on an awful lot since the pandemic. We've got 30 million people on the NHS app now, and engagement with health data is much higher profile than it was before the pandemic. Secondly, the way in which patients are engaged in trials has really changed. At Genomics England, we have a participant panel who are deeply involved not just in the design of use of the data, but in actually the design and structure of Genomics England, and they report directly into our board. They think about whether we put our data into the cloud, how we allow access to that data, the ethics structure of our organisation. And so I think deeply engaging participants with your organisation, and then when issues arise, they can go out and say, no, how the decisions were made, and really be your referee and ambassador. And that does require, of course, that you're doing things ethically and appropriately. But I think that it is, you bring in participants and public in your design, and then people can have confidence in what you're doing. And the last bit around structures and infrastructure. Firstly, I think the NHS app is a really important tool and it should be used. The second thing is the secure data environments work that I mentioned at the beginning that Tim Ferriss and Claire Bloomfield are working on, along with NHS England, and that's going to have the single data environment with the wider ones. There are going to be challenges with that technically in terms of using different technologies for the different environments, but I think that can be tackled. The most important element that I think you're talking about in terms of recruitment is Digitrials. So Digitrials has had some value in terms of the work that it's done. They helped recruit 140,000 for Grail. They put out a 10 million call for Our Future Health, but they've been at capacity and unable to really help across a large proportion of the value that they could add. So they've received some funding to really expand and to increase efficacy and efficiency, and so that has a lot more potential. But I think it's the link between the app and Digitrials and the underlying data infrastructure which is really important, and we need to work on improving. I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to go.
Well, I want to make sure Jack gets an answer to this question. So, Jen, let's come to you on this question about kind of the legislative framework we're operating in.
Yeah, really quickly. So, assuming that what we're talking about here is the kind of clinical trial legislation and the regulation there, in all honesty, we are the only country left on the planet operating off of the former EU directive. we have to evolve our regulation. So it's really important over the coming terms that we are enforcing and putting in place the regulation that we have that's been set out by the MHRA and the HRA, in order for us to first and foremost bring us up to speed with what is happening elsewhere. Companies are already navigating this. The FDA is far ahead on some of these elements, so we have to make sure that our regulations are up to speed. But there's also innovation and new things that companies are trying to do, such as things like decentralised clinical trials, remote clinical trials, etc. Diversity in clinical trial recruitment. We have to then also take that next leap, which is how do we evolve the regulation to keep pace with some of the new things that we are doing. So it is really important that we have the right legislative frameworks for these things, and that we don't start entering our, I think, third year as the only country under the old directive.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jen. We're going to have to wrap up because we are at times. There are three quick thank yous for me. One, a massive thank you to AstraZeneca for partnering with us on this. We're only able to do the work that we do because of partnerships with fantastic companies like AstraZeneca, so thank you. A second thank you to you all for coming along and for contributing with your questions and your attention for the last hour or so. And finally, if you just join me in giving a round of applause to thank our panel.